From your local election headquarters, this is The Insiders with Dave Price.
So we're 5+ weeks till the election and inflation is still way too high. The politicians can sometimes oversimplify why, but there could be a lot of factors to consider here. So we get a take from an economist on what's happening.
We threw a lot of dollars on the consumer side, but with the proviso that there not be production on the other side of the economy. And I think that that combination of a massive infusion of federal spending with a reduction in the supply of goods and services is feeding into inflation. Initially, the idea was that that was going to stimulate the economy, but most of that money got saved. So there was a huge increase in the fraction of the consumer budget that was saved in that initial year of the pandemic. And then we've been spending it ever since then. And so that's been fueling inflation.
So did the government throw too much at us?
If you look at the historical patterns of recessions in the past, the magnitude of the infusion of dollars in the pandemic is an order of magnitude larger. So early in the pandemic, the federal government skyrocketed to 30% of gross domestic product. The long run average has been 21% over many, many years. And since that initial infusion of funds, the federal government has been about 3 to 4 percentage points higher as a share of GDP than the historical average. So this infusion of funds was historically unprecedented as a share of the economy.
I'm curious how you look at money in this term. Is there any measurable difference when it comes to inflation, if you will, whether we're talking about the government sending COVID aid checks, tax cuts, the president forgiving student loans? Is each thing uniquely different, or will they all impact inflation in one way, potentially?
Well, I think it's useful to think back as to what we did during the Great Recession. So we had a large increase in federal spending, but the terminology of the day was build back better, not build back better, I apologize. Shovel-ready projects. Do you remember the term shovel-ready projects? So
no
we're
doubt.
going to actually be using that money to produce stuff. And that was the direction of federal infusions of money at that time. Disproportionately, this infusion has not been related to actual production. If you look at, say, the student debt relief, there's no concomitant production on the other side of that, and you're throwing about $500 billion into the consumer's budget. It's sort of an odd way to throw money in the budget, because what you're saying is you don't have to pay this money back, but it does effectively raise the wealth of those individuals, and it will ultimately feed into their consumer demands on top of everything else. And so I think what was unique about this particular period is how much of the federal infusion was just transfer payments and not actually related to some purchase of goods and services, and so some amount of production that was occurring on the other side of the ledger.
On the most basic level, the more money we have to spend as a consumer, that could then raise demand, could increase the rate of inflation. Is that fair or unfair? Or way too simple?
No, I mean, the classic definition of inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. There are a lot of other things that have led to inflationary pressures, right? So there was the reduction in international trade, some of that pandemic related and some related to policies that made trade more expensive, the tariff policies and so on. The pandemic itself leading to supply chain disruptions, but by far the largest supply chain disruption has been the insufficient labor supply. And so the reduction in the number of people who are wanting to work over the last 2.5 years is the largest disruption of the supply chain that we have in the current economy.
As voters are looking ahead to November, and I'm not going to push you into politics, but help us to understand some of these promises and ideas here. And as they try to plan who controls the state next year, both in terms of the governor's mansion and the legislature. So as we sit here right now, the governor just said over the past week, roughly speaking, about $4 billion in the bank or so in some of these major funds. Now the state has been awarded more than $10 billion in COVID aid relief from the feds. How does an Iowan look at these crazy big numbers and figure out the state's well-being and wondering if all this extra federal money is just kind of artificially making us look better than what we are? Are we healthy or not healthy? How do we know?
Well, an average state budget year is $8 billion, right? So when you get these infusions of federal dollars, not all of it to the government, of course, a lot of it into the private sector, but on the order of 2 to 3 times an annual budget for the state. I mean, those are just magnitudes that I'm not familiar with. I mean, I can remember when $1 billion was a lot of money, and now people throw around trillions like it's peanuts. And I guess I'd have to say that much infusion for what had been a relatively well-functioning economy. Remember, the unemployment rate nationally was 3.5% going into the pandemic. It's not that the economy was in a bad position. It's that the reduction, the actual recession that we had at that period of time was largely a result of government mandated shutdowns of a well-functioning economy, not a fundamental weakness of the economy. So throwing that many dollars on top of what was effectively a well-functioning economy was at least in retrospect, it was an overshooting what was actually necessary.
So how do voters now know if we can afford more tax cuts based on all of those factors you're talking about? Because some would want more tax cuts, obviously.
Well, I mean, how could we use this sudden infusion of dollars? I mean, one of the nicest things would be is if we could use the money for capital expenses that are going to give us benefits over a long period of time, and capital expenses that you might have thought were expenditures that we would face anyway. And the first one that top of mind for me would have been the fact that we have an underfunded state pension system, and we should have been able to use some of the money to make that pension system whole. I mean, if the state government were a private firm, it could not underfund its defined benefit plans by 18 percentage points or wherever we are now with the decline in the stock market. But we can't do that. So legally, you're not allowed to use that money to make pension systems whole. And I would bet you in state government after state government around the United States, that would be the easiest way of returning that money to the taxpayer as reducing a future tax liability. But I think if we can use the funds for things that are capital investments, that would be a really useful thing, whether it's improving state buildings or roads, projects like that. If it's going to be used for transfer payments for current consumption, then I think the money is going to be largely wasted.
Coming up next, a deeper look at what those first district debaters had to say.